Rome, 897th year. The Basilica of St. John Lateran is steeped in heavy silence. Inside the church, a scene unfolds such as the history of Christianity has never witnessed. In the center of the hall is a decomposing body, clad in papal vestments. These are the remains of Pope Formosus, who died 9 months ago. Opposite him sits the new Pope Stephen VI, his eyes burning with a feverish gleam. With each accusation hurled at the dead man, the faces of those present contort with horror and incomprehension. Behind the silent accused stands a young deacon, the only one who dared to take on the role of defender. His voice trembles as he tries to answer on behalf of his dead client. But the court is implacable. The verdict is predetermined. This sinister spectacle would go down in history as the Cadaver Synod, one of the darkest pages in the annals of the papacy, when the living judged the dead, and political intrigues reached their monstrous apogee. Rome at the end of the 9th century was a city plunged into chaos. The once majestic capital of the empire had become an arena of fierce power struggles between aristocratic families. The papal throne, which should have remained a symbol of spiritual unity, became a bargaining chip in the political games of influential dynasties. The Eternal City, which had survived the fall of the empire, barbarian invasions, and numerous wars, now faced a new trial: the internal decay of power. After the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, Italy found itself at the crossroads of various kingdoms and principalities' interests. Frankish rulers, German princes, Byzantine emperors, all claimed influence in the region. In this complex political game, the papacy, possessing not only spiritual but also significant secular authority, became the key prize. The aristocratic families of Rome, such as the Crescentii, Theophylacti, and the Margraves of Spoleto, formed a complex system of alliances and rivalries. Each family sought to place its protege on the papal throne, one who would protect their interests. This led to the Holy See being passed not based on piety or theological scholarship, but solely on political considerations. The streets of Rome at that time were pervaded by an atmosphere of constant tension. Armed clashes between supporters of various factions were commonplace. Ordinary citizens lived in constant fear, not knowing which family would gain ascendancy tomorrow and what consequences this would have for them. Basilicas and palaces turned into fortified strongholds, and church treasures were often used to finance private armies. In this atmosphere of general decay, the authority of the papacy suffered particularly. In the decade from 891 to 900, 9 pontiffs succeeded one another. Some of them ruled for only a few months, others for mere weeks. Each change of pope was accompanied by political upheavals and often violence. Formosus, who occupied the throne from 891 to 896, tried to navigate between various political forces. Initially, he supported Guy of Spoleto, crowning him emperor, but then shifted his support to Arnulf of Carinthia, a representative of the East Frankish dynasty. This political maneuver enraged the Spoleto faction, which did not forgive him for the betrayal. After the death of Formosus and the brief pontificate of Boniface VI, who ruled for only 15 days, Stephen VI ascended to the papal throne, a protege of the Spoleto party. His election was a direct result of the shift in the balance of power in favor of the Italian nobility after Arnulf of Carinthia left Italy due to illness. Stephen VI found himself in a difficult position. He needed to assert his legitimacy and at the same time appease his patrons from the House of Spoleto. Furthermore, there was a serious canonical problem. Many bishops had been ordained by Formosus, and if his pontificate were deemed illegitimate, all the sacraments and appointments he had performed would have to be declared invalid. In this tense environment, the idea of the Cadaver Synod was born, an unprecedented trial of a deceased pope in the history of the Church. This was not merely an act of personal revenge or madness, but a calculated political move aimed at delegitimizing all of Formosus's actions and strengthening the power of the Spoleto party. Formosus was born around 815 in the port city of Ostia, near Rome. From a young age, he distinguished himself as a man of extraordinary intellect and deep religiosity. Having taken holy orders, he quickly advanced through the ecclesiastical hierarchy thanks to his abilities and education. In 864, Pope Nicholas I appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Porto, an important diocese located at the mouth of the Tiber. One of the key moments in Formosus's career was his missionary work among the Bulgarians. In 866, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of the Bulgarian Khan Boris. The mission proved so successful that Boris even asked the Pope to appoint Formosus as Archbishop of Bulgaria. However, Pope Nicholas, fearing to lose such a valuable advisor, rejected this request. After the death of Nicholas I, Formosus's relations with the new Pope Adrian II remained stable, but under the next pontiff, John VIII, serious problems began. John, who suspected Formosus of excessive political ambitions, accused him in 876 of conspiring to seize the papal throne, as well as of leaving his diocese without permission. Formosus was forced to flee Rome. He was excommunicated and stripped of his rank. Only after the death of John VIII in 882 did the new Pope Marinus I restore Formosus to his rights and return him to the bishopric of Porto. When Pope Stephen V died in 891, the cardinal's choice fell on Formosus, an experienced ecclesiastical diplomat who by that time had reached an advanced age. His election violated a long-standing tradition, according to which bishops were not to transfer from one see to another. This canonical nuance would later become one of the main charges at the Cadaver Synod. Formosus's pontificate coincided with a difficult period in Italian history. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the peninsula became an arena of struggle between various claimants to the imperial title. Formosus initially supported Guy of Spoleto, crowning him emperor in 891. A year later, he also crowned Guy's son, Lambert, as co-ruler. However, relations with the Spoletan rulers soon deteriorated. Formosus, feeling increasing pressure from this powerful family, secretly appealed to Arnulf of Carinthia, ruler of the East Frankish kingdom, urging him to intervene in Italian affairs. In 894, Arnulf made his first campaign into Italy, but did not reach Rome. In early 896, when the situation for Formosus became critical due to the increased power of the Spoletan house, Arnulf finally arrived in Rome. Formosus solemnly crowned him emperor, effectively annulling Lambert's previous coronation. This political maneuver enraged the Spoletan party and their supporters in Rome. Shortly after Arnulf's coronation, Formosus died on April 4, 896. He was about 80 years old. His death occurred in the midst of a political crisis. Arnulf was forced to hastily leave Italy due to illness, and the Spoletan party was preparing for revenge. Formosus's legacy proved controversial. On the one hand, he was an educated and pious church figure, a successful missionary. On the other hand, his political maneuvers, especially the shift from supporting Spoleto to an alliance with Arnulf, created many enemies for him among the Roman nobility. It was these political decisions, rather than theological disagreements, that led to the unprecedented posthumous trial against him. When Stephen VI ascended to the papal throne in 896, few could have predicted what a dark page in the history of the Church he was destined to write. His path to the heights of the ecclesiastical hierarchy began in the small Italian town of Anagni, located 50 kilometers southeast of Rome. Hailing from the provincial nobility, Stephen received the traditional church education for his time, which opened the way for his spiritual career. Initially, he served as Bishop of Anagni, where he distinguished himself as a skilled administrator and devoted servant of the Church. However, his true rise began after he attracted the attention of the powerful house of Spoleto. The Margraves of Spoleto, especially Guy and his son Lambert, sought reliable allies among the higher clergy. Stephen, with his reputation as a competent church figure and lack of ties to opposing factions, seemed an ideal candidate to advance their interests. When Pope Formosus died in April 896, the political situation in Rome was extremely unstable. Arnulf of Carinthia, whom Formosus had crowned emperor, was forced to hastily leave Italy due to a sudden paralysis. This created a power vacuum, which the Spoleto party immediately exploited. After the brief pontificate of Boniface VI, which lasted only 15 days, Stephen, a loyal ally of the House of Spoleto, was elevated to the papal throne. His election was not a result of spiritual merits or theological achievements. It was a purely political move, aimed at strengthening the influence of the Spoleto faction in Rome. Lambert of Spoleto, feeling his power threatened after Arnulf's coronation, needed a pope who would annul Formosus's actions and recognize him, Lambert, as the sole legitimate emperor. Stephen, owing his elevation to the House of Spoleto, proved to be an ideal instrument for achieving this goal. Moreover, he himself had a personal score to settle with Formosus. As Bishop of Anagni, he had repeatedly clashed with Formosus's policy, aimed at limiting the influence of the Italian nobility in church affairs. Now, as Pope, he had the opportunity not only to take revenge on his predecessor, but also to strengthen his position by demonstrating absolute loyalty to the House of Spoleto. The first months of Stephen VI's pontificate passed relatively peacefully. He dealt with ordinary administrative matters, strengthened his position in the Curia, and established relations with various factions of the Roman nobility. However, beneath this external calm lay intense political work. Stephen and his advisors were developing a plan that was to once and for all resolve the problem of the legitimacy of his rule, and simultaneously strengthen the position of the House of Spoleto. The central element of this plan was the idea of a posthumous trial of Formosus. From a canonical point of view, if it could be proven that Formosus had unlawfully occupied the papal throne, all his actions, including the coronation of Arnulf, could be declared invalid. This would automatically make Lambert of Spoleto the sole legitimate emperor. By early 897, the plan was ready. Stephen, having secured the support of Lambert and his mother Agiltrude, began preparations for an unprecedented trial in the history of the Church. A trial of a dead man. This decision, dictated by political necessity and personal animosity, would soon lead to one of the darkest episodes in the history of the papacy, the Cadaver Synod, which would forever change Stephen VI's reputation and leave an indelible mark on the history of the Church. Behind the Cadaver Synod lay not mere emotions or personal animosity, but cold political calculation. To understand the true reasons for this event, one must unravel the complex web of interests intertwined around the papal throne of the late 9th century. At the heart of the conflict was the struggle between two powerful forces: the Italian House of Spoleto, represented by Lambert and his mother Agiltrude on one side, and the East Frankish king Arnulf of Carinthia on the other. Both laid claim to the imperial title and control over Italy. Formosus, attempting to maneuver between these forces, made a fatal error, first crowning Lambert and then siding with Arnulf, recognizing him as emperor and effectively annulling the coronation of his first chosen one. When Arnulf left Italy due to illness, the Spoleto party seized a chance for revenge. Stephen VI, being their protege, had to solve a serious legal problem: how to annul Arnulf's coronation and restore the imperial title to Lambert. The simplest solution seemed to be to declare Formosus's entire pontificate illegitimate. Here, a second important factor came into play: the question of the legitimacy of ordinations. Formosus, during his 5-year pontificate, had appointed many bishops and priests. If his rule were declared illegitimate, all these appointments would also become invalid. This created fertile ground for a large-scale personnel purge, allowing Stephen and his patrons to replace clergy loyal to Formosus with their own supporters. A third key factor was the struggle of Roman aristocratic factions. Rome at that time was divided among several powerful families, each striving to control the papal throne. The Cadaver Synod became a tool in this struggle, allowing the Spoleto party to strengthen its position and weaken its opponents. There was also a personal component. Stephen VI likely felt a certain animosity towards Formosus, who at one time might have hindered his career advancement. Furthermore, organizing such a shocking process demonstrated Stephen's absolute loyalty to the House of Spoleto and his willingness to go to extreme lengths for his patrons. It is important to understand that the accusations leveled against Formosus at the Cadaver Synod were merely a formal cover for political motives. The main charge was the violation of an ancient ecclesiastical rule prohibiting bishops from transferring from one see to another. Formosus, being the Bishop of Porto, became pope, which technically violated this canon. However, this rule had been violated before without such dramatic consequences. The real goal was not the restoration of canonical purity, but the delegitimization of all Formosus's political decisions, especially Arnulf's coronation. Stephen and his advisors carefully considered the legal aspects of the process. Formally, Formosus's corpse was not tried as a dead man. That would contradict ecclesiastical law. Instead, a legal fiction was employed. The court proceeded as if Formosus were still alive, but refused to appear at the session. A deacon, appointed as defender, was to speak on behalf of the accused, as if he were simply absent. This approach allowed them to circumvent canonical restrictions and create the appearance of a lawful process. But behind this legal casuistry lay a cynical political calculation, aimed at strengthening the power of one faction at the expense of another. The Cadaver Synod became the apogee of the politicization of the Church, when a spiritual institution was transformed into an instrument of worldly struggle for power. It was not merely an act of revenge or a manifestation of a single pope's madness, but a well-thought-out political action with specific goals: to strengthen the position of the House of Spoleto, annul Arnulf's coronation, and purge the ecclesiastical hierarchy of supporters of the previous regime. January of 897 was cold. The Roman sky was covered with leaden clouds, as if nature itself foresaw the sacrilege that was being prepared within the walls of the Lateran palace. Stephen VI, seated on the papal throne, issued an order that made even his closest supporters shudder: to exhume the body of Pope Formosus, who had died 9 months earlier. At night, under the cover of darkness, a group of clergymen, accompanied by armed guards, arrived at St. Peter's Cemetery. They worked in silence. Only the sound of shovels striking the frozen earth broke the quiet. When the wooden coffin finally emerged from beneath the layer of earth, Many of those present turned away, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. When the lid of the coffin was lifted, even the most steadfast recoiled. 9 months in the ground had transformed the once majestic pontiff into a gruesome semblance of a man. Decomposition had spared neither Formosus's face nor his hands. Decay had already significantly distorted his features, and the smell was so unbearable that some of those present could not suppress their retching. Despite the revulsion and fear, Pope Stephen's order had to be carried out. The body was carefully removed from the coffin and wrapped in cloth soaked in aromatic oils to at least partially mask the smell of decomposition. Then, the remains were loaded onto a cart and, under the cover of night, delivered to the Lateran Palace. In a specially designated room of the palace, a gruesome preparation for the trial began. Formosus's body was washed and treated with embalming compounds to slow further decomposition. Then it was dressed in full papal vestments, a white alb, a gold-embroidered chasuble, a pallium with embroidered crosses, and finally, the tiara, the symbol of papal authority. All these actions were accompanied by a grim solemnity. The priests involved in the process worked in a deathly silence, interrupted only occasionally by quiet prayers or stifled exclamations of revulsion when they had to touch the decaying flesh. The most challenging task was to place the body in a seated position. For this purpose, a special wooden structure was constructed, upon which Formosus's remains were placed. The deceased's hands were fixed in a position of blessing, a cruel irony given the circumstances. By Stephen's order, a young deacon was to stand beside the quote to act as a defender and answer on behalf of the dead pope. The choice fell on a young cleric known for his erudition but lacking significant political weight. When he was informed of the mission entrusted to him, the color drained from his face, but he dared not refuse. Preparation for the trial took several days. All this time, an atmosphere of superstitious fear permeated the Lateran Palace. Servants refused to approach the room where Formosus's remains were kept. Rumors circulated that strange sounds emanated from there at night, and guards swore they had seen a ghostly light seeping from under the door. Stephen VI personally oversaw all preparations. His face remained impassive as he inspected the body of his predecessor, prepared for trial. Only in his eyes did an expression sometimes flicker that could be taken as a mixture of triumph and hidden fear. From a psychological perspective, the exhumation and preparation of Formosus's body for trial represented an act of extreme symbolic violence. This was not merely the desecration of a grave, it was an attempt to completely destroy the memory of a man, to erase his legacy, to transform him from a respected pope into a damned heretic and criminal. Such an act held deep symbolic significance in medieval society, where the posthumous treatment of the body had immense religious importance. An untouched grave and prayers for the repose of the soul were essential elements of Christian tradition. By disturbing the peace of the deceased, Stephen was not merely insulting Formosus's memory, he was symbolically denying his right to Christian salvation. January of the year 897. The Basilica of St. John Lateran is filled with people. The atmosphere is tense to the breaking point. In the center of the hall, a throne is set up, upon which sits a gruesome figure, the decomposing body of Pope Formosus, clad in full papal regalia. Opposite him, on a raised platform, stands the reigning pontiff, Stephen VI, whose eyes burn with the feverish glint of a fanatic. The court proceedings begin with a solemn announcement. Stephen VI rises from his seat and with a loud voice proclaims the opening of the Church Synod to consider charges against Pope Formosus. Formally, the process is organized as if the accused were alive but refused to appear at the session, a legal ploy allowing them to circumvent the canonical prohibition against trying the dead. The composition of the court is carefully selected from Stephen's supporters and the Spoletan party. Among the judges are cardinals and bishops, whose elevation depended on the favor of the new pope. Many of them avoid looking at the ominous figure on the throne, from which, despite aromatic oils and incense, a heavy smell of decomposition emanates. Before the dead, quote, stands a young deacon, Formosus's sole defender. His face is pale, his hands tremble as he tries to peer into a scroll with prepared arguments. Everyone understands that his role is merely a formality, necessary to create the appearance of a fair trial. Stephen VI personally reads the accusations. His voice sounds confident, each word falling like a stone. You, Formosus, being Bishop of Porto, driven by immoderate ambition, unlawfully seized the apostolic see of Rome, violating sacred canons which forbid bishops from transferring from one see to another. The hall responds with a deathly silence. The defending deacon tries to object, pointing out that such transfers had occurred before without such severe consequences, but his weak voice is drowned out by the indignant exclamations of Stephen's supporters. The next accusation is even graver. The deacon attempts to explain that this oath was given under duress and later annulled by Pope Marinus I, but Stephen rudely interrupts him. The third accusation concerns the very essence of the political conflict. At the mention of Lambert of Spoleto, many of those present nod approvingly. The influence of the Spoletan party in the hall is evident. Then follow accusations of performing sacred rites while excommunicated, of embezzling church property, and even of practicing sorcery. Each new accusation is more absurd, but no one dares to openly object. After all accusations are read, the moment for the defense arrives. The deacon, appointed to speak on behalf of Formosus, tries to present arguments in his favor. He reminds them of Formosus's missionary successes among the Bulgarians, of his piety and learning, and that many of his actions were dictated by a sincere concern for the good of the Church. But each of his arguments is met with mockery and shouts of disbelief. Stephen VI repeatedly interrupts the defender, not allowing him to finish his thought. When the deacon tries to explain the political motives behind Arnulf's coronation, Stephen furiously pounds the armrest of his throne. He shouts. The court proceeds to vote. One by one, bishops and cardinals rise from their seats and pronounce. Some do so with visible enthusiasm, others with poorly concealed fear. But the outcome is predetermined. A unanimous verdict of guilt. Stephen VI rises to announce the sentence. His voice trembles with excitement as he declares all of Formosus's ordinations and decrees invalid, including the coronation of Arnulf of Carinthia. This means that Lambert of Spoleto remains the sole legitimate emperor. The main political goal of the process is achieved. But Stephen does not stop there. By his order, Formosus's papal vestments are torn from his body, the ultimate humiliation, a symbolic defrocking. Then he orders 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand to be cut off, those very fingers with which popes traditionally bless the faithful. The spectacle is so monstrous that even some of Stephen's supporters turn away. The young defending deacon faints and is carried out of the hall. Among the common priests and monks present at the synod, muffled sobs and prayers are heard. After the completion of this gruesome ceremony, Formosus's mutilated body is not returned to his tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, he is buried in a cemetery for foreigners outside the city. a final act of humiliation for a man who once held the highest spiritual office in Christendom. But even this was not enough for Stephen. A few days later, he orders the body to be exhumed again and thrown into the Tiber River, as if seeking not only to destroy Formosus's memory, but also to deprive his soul of peace in the afterlife. The Cadaver Synod became the culmination of political intrigues and personal revenge, cloaked in the form of a church trial. It was not merely a desecration of a grave or post-mortem humiliation. It was an attempt to rewrite history, to erase an entire pontificate from the Church's annals. But, as is often the case with acts of extreme cruelty, this trial ultimately turned against Stephen himself, staining his name through the ages and becoming a symbol of how deeply even the highest church hierarchs can fall in their pursuit of power. In the hall of the Lateran Basilica stood a young deacon, tasked with the unthinkable, to defend a dead man. History has not preserved his name, but chronicles mention that he was barely 25 years old. Pale, with trembling hands, he stood before the decaying body of his charge, trying to find words that could withstand the avalanche of accusations. "Most Holy Father," he addressed Stephen VI, his voice trembling but gradually gaining firmness, "allow me to remind you that the late Pope Formosus was known for his learning and piety. His mission to the Bulgarians led many to the true faith." In response, disdainful laughter erupted. Stephen VI raised his hand, calling for silence. "We are judging not his learning, but his crimes against the canons of the Church," he cut in. The deacon did not give up. He unrolled a parchment with excerpts from church documents. Regarding the accusation of transferring from one episcopal see to another, he continued, "there are precedents. Pope Marinus I was also a bishop before ascending to the throne of St. Peter, and no one disputed the legality of his pontificate." This argument caused confusion among the judges. Some began to whisper. Stephen, noticing this, struck the floor with his staff. Marinus's case was an exception, approved by a church council. Formosus, however, acted out of ambition, violating the oath given to Pope John VIII. "That oath was given under duress," the deacon countered. "Moreover, Pope Marinus I released him from that oath and restored him to the rank of bishop. This is confirmed by documents from the papal archive." Stephen reddened with anger. It was clear that the deacon's arguments were logical, but the political objective of the trial allowed for no logic. Stephen thundered. This threat had its effect. The deacon grew even paler, realizing that his own fate hung in the balance. He replied quietly. When the discussion turned to the coronation of Arnulf, the central point of the accusation, the deacon tried to explain the complex political situation in which Formosus found himself. But Stephen did not let him finish. He exclaimed. The deacon tried to explain that Formosus's decision was dictated by changed circumstances and the threat to the independence of the papal see from the House of Spoleto. But his voice was drowned out by the indignant shouts of Stephen's supporters. In a desperate attempt to save his client's reputation, the deacon recalled Formosus's charitable activities, his care for the poor of Rome, and the restoration of ruined churches. But these arguments had no bearing on the political accusations and were ignored. When the court proceeded to vote, the deacon realized that his mission had been doomed from the start. One by one, the bishops and cardinals pronounced. Some did so with enthusiasm, others with ill-concealed fear, but the outcome was predetermined. After the verdict was announced, as the papal vestments were torn from Formosus's body, the deacon could not bear it. He fell to his knees and began to pray loudly, asking God for mercy on Formosus's soul. Stephen ordered him to be removed from the hall. History has preserved evidence that after the Cadaver Synod, the young deacon left Rome and retired to a remote monastery in the mountains of Umbria. There, he recorded his memoirs of the trial, which became one of the few surviving testimonies of this somber event. His defense, though unsuccessful, remained an example of courage in an era when opposing authority meant risking one's own life. Centuries later, church historians acknowledge that the arguments put forth by the nameless deacon were legally sound, but the political nature of the trial left no room for justice. When the last voice pronounced guilty, an ominous silence fell over the hall of the Lateran Basilica. Stephen VI slowly rose from his throne, his face contorted into a triumphant grimace. He surveyed those present as if savoring the moment of his triumph, and loudly declared, "The court has found Formosus guilty of all charges. All his deeds, ordinations, and decrees are declared invalid. The coronation of the usurper Arnulf is annulled, and our pious protector, Lambert of Spoleto, remains the only legitimate emperor." These words were met with approving shouts from the supporters of the Spoletan faction. But the true horror was yet to come. Stephen signaled to his attendants, and they approached the silent figure on the defendant's throne. Stephen commanded, "From Formosus's decaying body, the papal regalia were torn away, the white alb, the gold-embroidered chasuble, the precious pallium. Each movement was accompanied by a repulsive smell of decay, intensifying as the body was exposed. Many of those present turned away, unable to watch this sacrilegious spectacle. When the body was stripped of its papal vestments, Stephen gave the most monstrous order. Cut off 3 fingers of his right hand, those with which he unlawfully blessed the people and performed sacrilegious sacraments. The executioner stepped forward with a knife in hand. The defending deacon, who had already risen after fainting, collapsed once more. The sound of flesh being severed made even the most hardened witnesses of the trial shudder. 3 fingers of the right hand, the index, middle, and thumb, with which popes traditionally bless the faithful, were detached from the body and thrown onto the floor of the basilica. "Now," Stephen said, looking at the disfigured body, "this false pope will not be able to bless anyone, neither in this world nor in the next." But Formosus's humiliation did not end there. By Stephen's order, the naked and mutilated body of the former pontiff was carried out of the basilica and dragged through the streets of Rome. Crowds of citizens watched this spectacle in horror and bewilderment. Many crossed themselves and whispered prayers, fearing that such sacrilege would bring divine wrath upon the city. That same evening, Formosus's remains were not returned to his former grave in St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, they were taken to the cemetery for foreigners outside the city walls, a place where nameless pilgrims who died far from home were buried. There, without funeral rites or prayers, without a memorial stone or cross, the body of the former pope was thrown into a hastily dug pit and covered with earth. But even this seemed insufficient to Stephen. A few days later, fearing that Formosus's grave might become a pilgrimage site for his supporters, he ordered the body to be exhumed again. This time, the remains of the former pontiff were taken to the banks of the Tiber. Stephen declared, as Formosus's body, tied to heavy stones, was thrown into the murky waters. News of the Cadaver Synod and the subsequent desecration of Formosus's body quickly spread throughout the Christian world. The reaction was mixed. Supporters of the Spoletan faction approved of Stephen's actions, seeing them as a restoration of justice. But many ordinary believers and clergy were shocked and outraged. In the taverns and market squares of Rome, people whispered the details of the trial, adding their own specifics and interpretations. Some saw this event as a sign of the end times, others as proof that the papal throne had been seized by the ungodly. Among the Roman clergy, a hidden discontent grew. Many priests had been ordained by Formosus, and now their status was called into question. If all of Formosus's actions as pope were declared invalid, did that mean their ordination was also without force? Stephen, intoxicated by his triumph, did not notice the growing discontent around him. He was convinced that he had obliterated the memory of his predecessor and strengthened his own position. But in reality, he had signed his own death warrant. A wave of popular anger caused by this sacrilegious act was already rising, ready to crash down upon the head of the man who dared to judge the dead. News of the Cadaver Synod spread through Rome like wildfire. At first, people refused to believe what was happening. Such sacrilege was unheard of, even in the cruel history of the Eternal City. But soon there was no doubt left. Pope Stephen VI had indeed exhumed the body of his predecessor and put him on trial, as if he were a living person. For the first few days after the synod, Romans were in a state of stupor. Fear of divine wrath paralyzed even the bravest. Many expected the earth to open up and swallow the city, defiled by such sacrilege. People spoke in whispers on the streets, afraid that Stephen's spies might overhear them. But gradually, shock gave way to indignation. At first, these were quiet conversations in taverns, then open discussions in market squares. The lower-ranking clergy were especially outraged. Many of them had received their orders under Formosus, and now their position was under threat. This question was heard more and more frequently and loudly. Rumors that Formosus's body had been thrown into the Tiber caused particular outrage. For medieval people, proper burial was of immense importance. To deny even a criminal this was considered unforgivable cruelty. Soon after the Cadaver Synod, Rome was struck by natural disasters. Heavy rains caused flooding, and then an earthquake damaged several ancient basilicas. For superstitious Romans, this was a clear sign of divine wrath. God is punishing us for allowing the grave of a holy man to be desecrated, people said. The story that Formosus's body was allegedly miraculously washed ashore and found by monks in an undamaged state quickly spread throughout the city, further fueling anti-papal sentiment. Stephen, intoxicated by his political triumph, did not notice the growing discontent. He continued to pursue policies aimed at strengthening the power of the Spoletan party, appointing his supporters to key ecclesiastical posts and persecuting all who were associated with Formosus. The straw that broke the camel's back came unexpectedly. In July 897, just a few months after the Cadaver Synod, a part of the Lateran Basilica collapsed, the very one where the ominous trial had taken place. For Romans, this was final proof that God had turned away from Stephen. "Even the stones cannot bear his impiety," people shouted in the squares. The city militia, usually maintaining order, increasingly refused to disperse protesters. Many of the guards themselves were outraged by the Pope's actions. The uprising erupted spontaneously. A group of citizens gathered at the ruins of the collapsed part of the Lateran Basilica began openly cursing Stephen. When the papal guard tried to disperse the crowd, stones flew at the guards. The conflict quickly escalated into street fighting. The rebels seized several areas of the city and moved towards the papal palace. Stephen, not expecting such a turn of events, found himself effectively trapped. His personal guard, seeing the numerical superiority of the rebels, showed little zeal in defending the pontiff, demanded the crowd surrounding the palace. Stephen tried to organize a defense, but many of his supporters, sensing that the wind had changed, hastened to abandon the sinking ship. When the rebels stormed the palace, Stephen tried to escape through a secret passage but was caught. The crowd demanded immediate retribution, but the intervention of several influential clerics prevented a lynching. Instead, it was decided to imprison Stephen in a monastic prison until an ecclesiastical trial could be held. The deposed pope was taken to the monastery of St. Sebastian outside the city walls. There he was confined to a narrow cell where the most dangerous criminals had previously been held. Stephen, who had recently sat on the papal throne, now found himself a prisoner awaiting trial. The irony of fate was that he was to appear before the very same ecclesiastical court that he had used against Formosus. Many of the bishops who had voted to condemn the dead pope were now preparing to judge the living one. However, the trial never took place. In August 897, less than a year after his ascension to the throne, Stephen VI was found dead in his cell. Officially, it was announced that he had died of illness, but persistent rumors circulated that the former pope had been strangled on the orders of his former allies, who feared revelations at the trial. Stephen's death did not end the crisis in Rome. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a period that historians would later call papal vindictiveness, a time when successive pontiffs either rehabilitated Formosus or condemned him again, depending on their political affiliation. Stephen's body was buried without honors in an unmarked grave. No one offered a funeral prayer for him. No one mourned him. The man who dared to judge the dead was himself consigned to oblivion, as if he had never occupied the throne of St. Peter. After the fall of Stephen VI, Rome plunged into a period of chaos that historians would later call the era of papal vindictiveness. The throne of St. Peter became a bargaining chip in the endless game of Roman aristocratic factions. In the 3 years following the Cadaver Synod, 6 pontiffs succeeded one another, each either affirming Formosus's condemnation or rehabilitating him, depending on the political climate. Stephen's first successor was Romanus, who held the throne for only 4 months, from August to November of 897. Little is known about his personality. The meager sources of the time only state that he was a cardinal under Formosus, and possibly even his supporter. Romanus cautiously began the process of reviewing the decisions of the Cadaver Synod, but did not manage to complete it. Under mysterious circumstances, he was deposed and forcibly tonsured as a monk. Romanus was succeeded by Theodore II, who reigned for only 20 days in December of 897. Despite the brevity of his pontificate, he managed to take a decisive step towards restoring justice. Theodore officially declared all decisions of the Cadaver Synod invalid and restored the legitimacy of ordinations performed by Formosus. By order of Theodore, Formosus's body, miraculously discovered by fishermen in the Tiber, according to legend, the remains were washed ashore by a sudden flood, was reburied with honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The reburial ceremony became an act of symbolic atonement. The body was clothed in new papal vestments, and a solemn mass was celebrated over the grave. But the most significant contribution to Formosus's rehabilitation was made by Pope John IX, elected in early 898. Unlike his predecessors, he managed to remain on the throne for almost 2 years. John convened an ecclesiastical council in Ravenna, which finally annulled all decisions of the Cadaver Synod and forbade judging the dead in the future. The Acts of the Council of Ravenna in 898 stated, quote, "John IX also restored all of Formosus's decrees and recognized all his ordinations as valid. This was of immense practical importance, as many bishops and priests ordained by Formosus continued to serve. Their status, questioned by the Cadaver Synod, was now officially confirmed. However, political passions did not subside. After the death of John IX in 900, Benedict IV ascended the throne, continuing the policy of Formosus's rehabilitation. But already in 903, he was succeeded by Leo V, who reigned for only a month, after which he was overthrown by Christopher, who in turn held power for only half a year. In 904, Sergius III became pope, a representative of the opposing faction. He again condemned Formosus's memory and confirmed the decisions of the Cadaver Synod. By his order, Formosus's gravestone was destroyed, and all his supporters were persecuted. Sergius even ordered a fresco depicting scenes from the Cadaver Synod to be made to immortalize the triumph of justice. This change of course reflected not theological disagreements, but exclusively political struggle. By that time, the influence of the Theophylacti family, especially Theodora and her daughter Marozia, who effectively controlled the papal throne, had grown stronger in Rome. The period known as the pornocracy, or rule of harlots, began, when popes were appointed and deposed at the will of these influential women and their allies. The era of papal vindictiveness clearly demonstrated the deep crisis of the papacy at the end of the 9th and beginning of the 10th centuries. The Holy See, which was supposed to remain a bulwark of spirituality and moral authority, became a toy in the hands of aristocratic factions. Popes succeeded each other with kaleidoscopic rapidity, often failing to leave any trace other than a name in the chronicles. For ordinary believers, this time became a test of faith. How could one trust a church whose leaders acted so unworthily? Many turned to local shrines and revered monks, seeing in them the true bearers of Christian values. Unlike the hierarchs mired in political intrigues, the Cadaver Synod and the subsequent era of vindictiveness became one of the darkest periods in the history of the papacy, clearly demonstrating to what depths the Church can sink when spiritual values are sacrificed to political ambitions. The legend of Formosus's body begins at the moment his remains were cast into the murky waters of the Tiber. It seemed Pope Stephen VI not only denied his predecessor a dignified burial, but also sought to erase his very memory by consigning his body to the river's elements. However, the story did not end there. It merely took on a new, almost mystical dimension. According to traditions recorded by Benedictine monks, on the night after Formosus's body was thrown into the river, an unprecedented thunderstorm erupted over Rome. Lightning rent the sky, and the waters of the Tiber rose, overflowing their banks. Many Romans interpreted this as a clear sign of divine wrath. Early the next morning, a group of fishermen, who had gone out to fish after the storm, made an astonishing discovery. On a sandy shoal at a bend in the river, not far from the Basilica of St. Paul, outside the walls, they found a body in the remnants of ecclesiastical vestments. Despite the time spent in the water, it remained remarkably preserved. The fishermen, recognizing the former pope in the found body, did not dare to report it to the city authorities, fearing the wrath of Stephen VI. Instead, they secretly delivered the remains to the nearest monastery, where the abbot, a supporter of Formosus, ordered the body to be hidden in the monastic chapel. News of the miraculous recovery of Formosus's body quickly spread among his supporters. Soon, a legend arose, embellished with many mystical details. It was said that the body itself floated against the current, that strange lights accompanied it over the water, that fish guarded it from predators. Some witnesses even claimed to have seen the severed fingers of his right hand miraculously rejoining the body. The monks who hid Formosus's body began to record stories of miracles allegedly occurring near his remains. The sick who touched his shroud recovered, the blind regained their sight, and the mute found their voice. These stories, though not officially recognized by the Church, became part of popular tradition. After the overthrow of Stephen VI, when Theodore II ascended to the papal throne, Formosus's body was solemnly reburied in St. Peter's Basilica. The ceremony became an act of symbolic atonement. The remains were clothed in new papal vestments, and a solemn mass was celebrated over the grave. The legend of the miraculous return of Formosus's body from the Tiber holds deep symbolic meaning in the context of medieval religious consciousness. For the people of that time, it was clear proof of Formosus's innocence and divine intervention in his fate. The river, which was supposed to be the place of his final disappearance, instead became the means of his symbolic resurrection and rehabilitation. In medieval hagiography, the lives of saints, such miraculous discoveries of incorrupt bodies were a common motif. They served as a sign of special divine grace, a testament to the deceased's sanctity. In Formosus's case, this legend also performed an important political function. It legitimized the actions of those popes who sought to annul the decisions of the Cadaver Synod. From a theological perspective, the story of Formosus's body fit into the belief that God does not leave the unjustly accused unprotected. Just as many early Christian martyrs miraculously avoided the destruction of their remains, Formosus's body was preserved for a dignified burial, despite human malice. The Cadaver Synod of 897 left a profound mark not only on the political history of the papacy, but also on the development of ecclesiastical theology and canon law. The trial of the dead pontiff posed fundamental questions to the Church, the answers to which were formulated over the subsequent centuries. The first and most acute question was concerning the validity of sacraments performed by a condemned clergyman. If Formosus was deemed an illegitimate pope, did this mean that all his ordinations, church consecrations, and other sacramental acts were invalid? This question had not only theoretical significance. The status of hundreds of priests and bishops across Europe was called into question. In the discussions that followed the Cadaver Synod, a doctrine known as ex opere operato, by the work performed, gradually took shape. According to this principle, the validity of a sacrament depends not on the personal qualities or canonical status of the officiating clergyman, but on the correct performance of the rite itself with proper intention. As the theologian Peter Damian later wrote, "The unworthiness of the minister does not diminish the power of the sacrament, for the Holy Spirit acts independently of human merits." This principle, though not formulated immediately after the Cadaver Synod, gained significant development precisely due to the theological problems posed by the trial of Formosus. A second important consequence was the development of canon law regarding posthumous trials. The Council of Ravenna in 898, convened by Pope John IX, not only annulled the decisions of the Cadaver Synod, but also established an important precedent prohibiting the judgment of the dead. "No one shall be brought to trial after death, for they have already appeared before the judgment of God, where there is no place for human vengeance." This principle became fundamental for the further development of ecclesiastical law. It recognized the limits of human jurisdiction and affirmed that the final judgment of a human soul belongs only to God. In subsequent centuries, this provision was repeatedly confirmed by ecclesiastical councils and became part of the main compilations of canon law. A third significant consequence was the formation of stricter rules for papal elections. The chaos that followed the Cadaver Synod when popes succeeded each other with kaleidoscopic rapidity, clearly demonstrated the need for reform. Although a complete reform of papal elections occurred only in the 11th century under Pope Nicholas II, the first steps in this direction were taken precisely as a reaction to the events of the late 9th century. A fourth important theological consequence was the development of the doctrine of the continuity of apostolic succession, even in conditions of unworthy behavior by individual hierarchs. The Church faced the need to explain how apostolic succession is maintained if one of the links in this chain is deemed invalid. The solution was found in distinguishing between the person of the cleric and his sacramental function. As Thomas Aquinas later wrote, "The priest acts not by his own power, but by the power of Christ, whose instrument he is." This teaching allowed for the preservation of the idea of continuous apostolic succession even during periods of profound ecclesiastical crises. A fifth consequence was the rethinking of attitudes towards the body of the deceased. The desecration of Formosus's remains caused deep outrage not only among his supporters, but also among ordinary believers. In subsequent centuries, the Church developed a more detailed teaching on the veneration of the remains of the dead, viewing the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, worthy of respect even after death. The Cadaver Synod also contributed to the development of ideas about the boundaries of papal authority. Although the doctrine of papal infallibility was formulated much later, the events of the late 9th century forced theologians to consider the limits of papal jurisdiction and the mechanisms for controlling potential abuses. As one medieval commentator wrote, "Even the vicar of Peter is bound by the law of Christ and cannot act against it." This idea was further developed in the teaching that the Pope, although possessing the highest earthly authority in the Church, is himself subject to divine law and the tradition of the Church. Thus, the Cadaver Synod, being one of the darkest episodes in the history of the papacy, paradoxically contributed to the development of ecclesiastical theology and law. The shock of this event compelled the Church to more deeply reflect on the fundamental questions of its structure and to develop principles, many of which remain relevant to this day. The Cadaver Synod became not only a shocking historical episode, but also a cultural phenomenon that left a deep mark on art, literature, and the collective memory of European civilization. Over the centuries, this grim event has inspired artists, writers, and historians, each interpreting it through the prism of their time and worldview. In medieval iconography, the Cadaver Synod was rarely depicted directly. The subject itself seemed too sacrilegious. However, indirect allusions can be found in 10th and 11th century manuscripts, where Pope Formosus is often portrayed with a martyr's halo, and Stephen VI with demonic features. In one illustration from the chronicle of the monk Liutprand of Cremona, Stephen appears with a face contorted by rage, while Formosus's body is surrounded by a radiance, a vivid expression of the medieval understanding of the event as a struggle between good and evil. During the Renaissance, interest in the Cadaver Synod was rekindled in the context of growing criticism of papal abuses. The Florentine artist Sandro Botticelli, working during a period when the papal throne was occupied by controversial figures like Alexander VI Borgia, created a series of drawings illustrating Dante's, quote, "In one of them, depicting the circle of hell for false prophets, researchers see an allusion to Stephen VI, although Dante himself does not mention this pope directly." In literature, the Cadaver Synod first received a detailed description in Liutprand of Cremona's Antipodosis, written in the mid-10th century. This text, full of dramatic details and moral judgments, became the primary source for subsequent generations. Liutprand, who made no secret of his disgust at what had happened, wrote, "What madness seized those who condemned a dead man, as if a corpse could defend itself against accusations or answer questions. During the Enlightenment, the Cadaver Synod became a symbol of religious fanaticism and institutional decay. Voltaire, in his philosophical dictionary, used this episode as an illustration of the barbarity to which the Church can descend when it is driven not by faith, but by lust for power. Edward Gibbon, in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, dedicated several scathing pages to the Cadaver Synod, calling it the most ghastly comedy ever played before the Christian world. The Romantic 19th century, with its interest in Gothic themes and medieval exoticism, rediscovered the Cadaver Synod. Victor Hugo mentioned it in his novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame as an example of extreme religious fanaticism. The American writer Edgar Allan Poe, fascinated by themes of death and the afterlife, used motifs from the Cadaver Synod in several of his short stories, albeit without direct historical references. In the 20th century, the Cadaver Synod became the subject of more objective historical analysis. While earlier historians saw in it only an manifestation of personal revenge or religious madness, modern researchers emphasize the complex political context of the event. Works by historians Peter Partner, Eric Duchesne, and Claudio Rendina have shown that perfectly rational political motives lay behind the macabre spectacle. In contemporary popular culture, the Cadaver Synod continues to inspire creators. In the 2000s, Italian director Paolo Sorrentino included allusions to this event in his film Youth, and British writer Ian Pearce used it as a central historical backdrop for his detective novel The Dream of Scipio. Historiographical interpretations of the Cadaver Synod have evolved from moralistic condemnations to complex analysis. Medieval chroniclers, such as Liutprand of Cremona and Flodoard of Rheims, saw it primarily as a moral catastrophe, a sign of the papacy's decline. Church historians of the Counter-Reformation era, such as Cesare Baronius, sought to minimize the significance of this episode, presenting it as an isolated deviation that did not affect the essence of papal authority. In the 19th century, with the development of critical historiography, the Cadaver Synod began to be viewed in a broader context. The German historian Leopold von Ranke and his followers emphasized the political aspects of the event, seeing in it a manifestation of the struggle between various factions of the Roman aristocracy. The French historian Louis Duchesne, in his monumental History of the Early Church, for the first time analyzed in detail the canonical aspects of the Cadaver Synod, showing how political motives were cloaked in the form of legal accusations. More than 1,000 years after the Cadaver Synod, its grim shadow still hangs over church history, a reminder of how easily power can corrupt even the most sacred institutions. What did this horrifying episode give us, besides a macabre anecdote from the past? What lessons can we draw from this event today as religious and political ethics continue to evolve? First and foremost, the Cadaver Synod became a turning point in the development of canon law. After the shock caused by Stephen VI's actions, the Church realized the need to create more reliable mechanisms for controlling the power of the pontiffs. The Council of Ravenna in 898 not only annulled the decisions of the Cadaver Synod, but also established a crucial principle. This principle, born from the sacrilegious act of a posthumous trial, became fundamental for all subsequent legal tradition, not only ecclesiastical, but also secular. Modern law in many countries also contains provisions limiting posthumous prosecution and protecting the dignity of the deceased. A second important consequence was the gradual reform of papal election procedures. The chaos of the when pontiffs succeeded each other with kaleidoscopic speed clearly demonstrated the danger of politicizing the Church. Although a full reform occurred only in the mid-11th century under Pope Nicholas II, the first steps in this direction were taken precisely as a reaction to the events of the late 9th century. The Cadaver Synod also contributed to the development of the doctrine of the separation of a cleric's person and his sacramental function. The question of the validity of sacraments performed by a condemned pope forced theologians to develop the doctrine of ex opere operato, by the work performed. According to this principle, sacraments are effective, regardless of the moral qualities of the priest performing them, provided the correct form of the rite is observed. This doctrine was of immense importance for maintaining the integrity of the Church during periods of crisis. It allowed believers to remain confident in the efficacy of the sacraments, even in the face of unworthy behavior by Church hierarchs. In a sense, it was an acknowledgement that human imperfection cannot impede divine grace. The most long-term consequence of the Cadaver Synod was the gradual realization of the need to limit the influence of secular power on the Church. The events of the late 9th century showed the catastrophic consequences that could arise from turning the papal throne into a tool of political intrigue. This realization, though not immediately, led to the Gregorian reform of the 11th century, aimed at freeing the Church from secular control. Pope Gregory VII, who initiated this reform, undoubtedly considered the lessons of the Dark Age of the papacy when formulating his program of church renewal. For modern religious ethics, the Cadaver Synod serves as a powerful reminder of the danger of conflating spiritual authority with political ambition. It demonstrates how easily religious institutions can be distorted when they become instruments in the struggle for worldly power. In an era when religion still plays a significant role in the political life of many countries, this lesson remains relevant. The separation of church and state, so important for modern democratic societies, has its roots in part in the understanding of such grim episodes of church history as the Cadaver Synod. For political ethics, the story of the trial of the dead pope reminds us of the danger of using legal procedures to achieve political ends. The Cadaver Synod was a trial in form, but in essence, an act of political revenge clothed in legal formalities. In the modern world, where the rule of law is considered a fundamental principle, the history of the Cadaver Synod warns against turning justice into a tool of political struggle. It reminds us that even the most perfect legal procedures can be perverted when they are driven not by the search for truth, but by the desire to destroy a political opponent. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Cadaver Synod is the reminder of how fragile even the most stable institutions can be in the face of human passions. The papacy, which survived the fall of the Roman Empire and the invasions of barbarians, found itself defenseless against the ambitions and intrigues of its own representatives. And yet, the history of the Cadaver Synod is not only a story of decline, but also a story of revival. After a period of deep crisis, the Church found the strength to renew itself. The reforms, initiated as a reaction to the shocking events of the late 9th century, ultimately led to the strengthening of institutions that made a repetition of such excesses impossible. 1,000 years later, the Cadaver Synod remains a grim but important reminder that all power, secular or spiritual, needs limits and checks. Without them, even the noblest institutions can become tools in the hands of those who place personal ambition above morality and justice.